We are moving on to the keynote address session. We are very honored to have the first keynote speaker, Professor Dr. Stein Tønnesson, here with us today. Professor Dr. Stein Tønnesson is a research professor at Peace Research Institute, Oslo, Norway. He is also a leader of East Asia Peace Program, Uppsala University, Sweden. His main areas of research are Vietnam, nation building in Southeast Asia, and the disputes in the South China Sea. From 2001 to 2009, he was appointed as a director of Peace Research Institute, Oslo, Norway. He also spent 1 year as Randolph Jennings Senior Fellow at United States Institute of Peace, Washington, D.C.
Since 2011, Professor Dr. Stein Tønnesson has led a research program on the East Asia Peace at Uppsala University, Sweden. He is currently Associate Editor for Asia, Journal of Peace Research, and a frequent commentator in Norwegian and international media on issues of peace and conflict. His publications focus on conflict and peace studies in Asia. Ladies and gentlemen, we are most fortunate this morning to be able to hear Professor Tønnesson speak to us on From Bombs to Banners, How Rebels Change from Armed to Unarmed Tactics. Please welcome Professor Dr. Stein Tønnesson.
I would like to start by thanking Prince of Songkla University for inviting me to give this speech. I feel very honored. I also would like to thank all of you for welcoming me back for the third time here to Patani. I came the first time in 2010, and I attended the conference in Hat Yai in 2012 and also had the chance to tour this region at that time. I've also had the pleasure of receiving Sri Sumpo Jitpiromsri at Uppsala University in Sweden and have learned much from my communication from him. My keynote address does not directly deal with communication, but more with the content of the communication. But I think that it's important for communication also what we communicate. And one thing I notice here is that just in this region where there has been and still is so much armed conflict, you are also able to draw in global and regional perspectives. And that's also the attempt that I'm going to make. And there, my message to you is that what we see in this area is an anomaly. Actually, the general picture in the East Asian region is peace. This is the subject of the study that we are undertaking in Uppsala. The reasons why East Asia has become so astoundingly peaceful since the 1970s. From this general trend that I will expose to you, Thailand forms an exception. And I want to understand why Thailand is different. I do not have the answer. I hope that some of you will help me explain this during these days. Thailand has, in the period when the rest of the region has become more and more peaceful, got three kinds of armed conflict, three categories that we use in our research. One is international conflict with Cambodia. One is internal conflict over government with violence being used in the streets of Bangkok. And the third is conflict over territory here in the Deep South. These are three of the main categories of armed conflict that we have, and Thailand has had all three of them. There can be several reasons why East Asia has become so much more peaceful. But one of the reasons that we are exploring in our research is a change in rebel behavior. That rebels in countries in East Asia have changed from the people's war tactic of the past to more unarmed campaigns. And that's the subject of my talk, and the question I'm asking is, why has this not happened in South Thailand? East Asia used to be one of the main, or the main region of war in the world. And the wars were endemic in East Asia from the 1840s until the 1970s. You can read the history of East Asia in that period and see just one war followed the other. And when we look at statistics, we also see that a very high proportion of the people killed in war in the world were killed in East Asia. This was also the case during the Cold War, particularly the first phase of the Cold War, where the wars in East Asia were hot inside the Cold War. If an insurgency on the level of what you now have or what has taken place in South Thailand in the last 10 years had taken place during the Cold War, it would have drowned as a very small affair in all the wars of East Asia. Something changed during the Cold War when Northeast and Southeast Asia in a way merged into a more and more integrated region where governments, one after the other, applied what we may call economy first policies. When they changed to economy first policies, they also needed stability, both externally and internally. One such attempt, for instance, to overcome conflict and gain international stability was associated with the formation of ASEAN in 1967, where conflict between Malaysia and Indonesia was overcome, so there has been no armed conflict since. When I was in Hat Yai in 2012, former Prime Minister Mahathir Mohamad gave a speech about how old-fashioned armed conflict was in his view, that Asians did not deal with armed conflict. We Asians, we are more civilized. We can leave armed conflict to the Americans. This was his message, which made a great impression on me. I taped all he said, and I'm going to cite him at length in a book I'm working on. This change started in a way in Japan under Yoshida, with the Yoshida Doctrine, where Japan opted out of war. And then it happened in South Korea, in Singapore, Indonesia, Malaysia, and the big change came when Deng Xiaoping took over in China. And then Vietnam was a latecomer, and now Myanmar is trying the same thing. So, in a way, the region became a region of economic growth and much less fighting. I take these illustrations from a book about regions by Barry Buzan and Ole Wever, where they talk about security complexes. And they say that during the first phase of the Cold War, there was a Northeast Asian and a Southeast Asian security complex. They merged in the second phase when you had the partnership with the United States and China against the Soviet Union, while the South Asian security complex is more separate. I agree with them that there is a distinct difference in the trajectory of violence and war between East Asia and South Asia. And that's important also because we have several South Asian speakers at this conference who can speak more about similarities between South Asia and Southeast Asia. When we do research in Uppsala on what we call the East Asian peace, we base this on statistics. The two institutes that I'm associated with, the Peace Research Institute in Oslo and the Department of Peace and Conflict Research at Uppsala University in Sweden, those two work closely together on peace and conflict statistics. So you will now see quite a lot of statistics in the next 10 minutes. And the first finding that we have is that when we look at the number of armed conflicts, and armed conflicts need to reach a threshold of 25 battle deaths in 1 year in order to be counted in the statistics. There is nothing magic about 25, one just has to choose some threshold. And 25 seems relatively low so that we capture many armed conflicts. We also talk about wars, and when we say wars, it's a minimum of 1,000 killed in 1 year. This is also used in the correlates of war statistics in the United States. So when we look at armed conflicts, you see that there was a reduction. First it was halved, and then it has stabilized around approximately 5 armed conflicts per year in East Asia. And this is 5 out of the total number of 30 to 40 in the world as a whole. That reduction is not very impressive, but it's still substantial. The reduction in the number of wars is more impressive. This shows how few wars there are left in East Asia that cost a minimum of 1,000 lives per year. The only more recent year when one conflict has as many as 1,000 deaths was in 2000, and that was in the Philippines. Since 2000, there has not been one single war costing as much as 1,000. And this distinguishes East Asia from other world regions. The third factor, which I believe is the most important, is to look at the number of deaths. And we have statistics that calculate the number of battle deaths in armed conflicts and wars. And those figures become the more, because they capture both the number of conflicts and the intensity of conflicts, I see that as the best indicator. And there you can see that in the Cold War period, just after the Second World War and up until 1979, there was a substantial number of wars in the region. This was the first Indochina War, the Chinese Civil War, the Korean War, and then came the Vietnam War, which has been the biggest war of all since the Second World War. And the last little top was the war between China and Vietnam in 1979. After that, it flattens out in the 1980s, where you still had the third Indochina War going on in Cambodia, but then that ends more or less after the Cambodian settlement in 1991, and you get very, very few people killed in East Asia. Here you see the same figure, but I compare it here with the rest of the world. And you see how East Asia is different from the rest of the world. East Asia had so much conflict until the 1970s, but it dropped in the 1980s, while all the other regions in the world increased in the 1980s. Actually, the 1980s was the worst decade of all decades since the Second World War in the rest of the world, but not in East Asia. And then when you get to the 1990s, most of the world drops down, so the whole world becomes more peaceful with less armed conflict. And East Asia actually becomes astoundingly peaceful in a comparative perspective. If we compare the big world regions, you can see here that Asia, Africa for a long time had the greatest number of people killed in armed conflict, but Asia has surpassed Africa. But then Asia has so much higher population. So Asia has topped it, but that is not East Asia. If we divide Asia in West Asia, or what is often called the Middle East, and South Asia, centered around India, and then East Asia, starting with Myanmar and the whole ASEAN area, and Northeast Asia, including Mongolia, Japan, Korea, you see that the part of Asia that has the largest population, namely East Asia, has the lowest number of people killed in armed conflict. This is just the figures that went into the graphs that you just saw, where you see that the numbers remain on a certain level in the 1980s, but then they go down. And in the year of 2010, we just counted 674 battle deaths in all of East Asia, which is an extremely low figure. So the subject of the research program that I lead at Uppsala is simply this: how come? How could such a war-torn, huge region turn into a region of such astoundingly low level of armed conflict? And we work with various explanations: changes in the balance of power, the ASEAN way, constructivist explanations, Chinese political culture, economic interdependence, and change in states, that states become more legitimate, there is more rule of law. And I already mentioned my pet hypothesis, which is the change to economy-first policies in one country after the other. And there is also a good argument to be made for state capacity, that states have become richer, more powerful, more able to repress rebels, also more able to administer their country in ways that do not allow or give reason for armed conflict. But then the explanation that I deal with now is not what states are doing, but what rebels are doing. So the thesis, or the sub-thesis that we have established in the program, is that there has also been a change in rebel behavior in East Asia, from bombs to banners, from people's war doctrine to something that could be called people power. And that's what I'm going to explore a little now. A first assumption within this thesis is that the decline in warfare does not mean that conflict has disappeared. It means that conflicts are being fought out in other ways than through armed conflict, through armed struggle. Then there is also something we have noticed through our research, and that is that East Asia has had very few peace agreements. There are many peace agreements in other parts of the world, many of which have failed, but in East Asia there are relatively few peace agreements. When you think about them, you think perhaps mainly about the failed agreements in Indochina, until the one which I consider to have been more successful in 1991. And you consider also the fact that the Korean conflict was not resolved through any peace agreement. There is still no peace agreement. There is just an armistice that divides Korea. So one immediately thinks about the Aceh agreement in 2005 as a more or less successful peace agreement. Although many deficiencies, at least it put an end to the armed conflict, and Aceh also became a much more prosperous part of Indonesia than it had been before, afterwards. So in a way, the 1991 agreement on Cambodia and the 2005 agreements on Aceh are the main examples, but there are not many others. What we see is that when armed conflicts have ended in East Asia, they have normally petered out. There have been rebellions for a long time, and then they have become less and less intense, and instead, in the end, they have disappeared. One example of this is the communist insurgency in Malaysia, which was based on sanctuaries here in South Thailand. It started 1948. It was defeated, we may say, in the late 1950s or 60s, but it continued to linger on until Jinping finally gave up in 1989. So this seems to be, in a way, perhaps the most typical way that an armed conflict of the kind that you have now in South Thailand, that it ends. Just goes on, it seems forever and ever, but in the end it peters out. Why has this happened? Why have armed conflict, armed rebellions not succeeded more? The impression I had in my youth in the 1960s and 70s was that guerrilla warfare was a thing of the future. There had been this great success in China for Mao. There was the struggle in Vietnam. We were much inspired by Che Guevara at the time on the left in Europe and all over the world. We thought this was a thing of the future. And then it changed in the 1980s. After that, armed rebellions hardly succeeded at all. And there was something else that started to succeed, and that was more unarmed campaigns, which I will return to in a moment. And we are discussing why has this changed? And one thesis is that the cost of armed conflict increased. It became simply much more difficult to carry out that kind of armed insurgency when you had much stronger states, when you had more urbanized societies, when you had more communications, both communications for surveillance and roads that made transport easier for armies and so on. Simply the cost of an armed rebellion became too high. And then we have made also statistics of unarmed campaigns in internal conflicts. And we have come to the conclusion that they are more often successful than the armed rebellions. Unarmed campaigns have often succeeded. They are also often repressed. And there can be massacres against unarmed rebels, but the success rate is much higher than the very low success rate for armed rebellions. So this higher success rate, the way that you can see that you can succeed, may also be an explanation why there has been an increase in unarmed campaigns and a reduction in armed rebellion. And one reason why unarmed campaigns can perhaps be more successful is that they sometimes play on divisions within regimes. When you have different factions within a regime that disagree, it's more difficult for the hardliners to repress an unarmed rebellion than to repress an armed rebellion. If there is an armed rebellion, there will often be consensus in the governing elite that we have to repress it, and we have to give the necessary powers to the army to repress it. If there is an unarmed campaign, it can more often arouse sympathy also among a faction of the elite in a country. So this is actually one of the conditions for success of an unarmed rebellion, that you also have division within the regime. I list here a number of unarmed campaigns in East Asia. In various, some of them were repressed. If you look at Manila 1986, that is in a way, that was the rebellion that gave us the term people power. And it was successful in terms of ending the Marcos regime. The long unarmed campaign in Taiwan paved the way for the reforms in 1987 and the introduction of democracy in Taiwan. The unarmed student rebellion at Tiananmen in 1989 was repressed, but it was in a way an archetypical example because there was division within the Chinese Communist Party, and so it could have tipped either way. The factor that determined the outcome was the power of Deng Xiaoping and his determination to repress the rebellion. And then you have in the same year the successful one in Mongolia. And you had also the end of the Suharto regime in Indonesia. Many of these have succeeded. In Korea, the one in Gwangju 1980 failed, and it failed in a massacre. But then, 8 years later, you got a new campaign that led to the democratization of South Korea. And you've had the repressed campaigns in Burma or Myanmar, the same country that has also had a lot of armed conflicts. So several countries, most countries actually, who have unarmed campaigns also have armed conflicts. But it's clear from our research that the unarmed campaigns are more successful than the armed conflicts. And then you see at the bottom line that the main country of unarmed campaigns is also Thailand, with all the whole history of unarmed insurrections of various kinds in Bangkok. Thailand, in a way, is the laboratory for research both on unarmed campaigns and in later years on armed conflict. So within our program on the whole of East Asia, Thailand has become the case that we strive most to understand. We've also carried out, together with the KPI Institute, a survey of attitudes in Thailand to violence, where we try to see if the attitudes are different in Thailand from other countries. But I would not say that we have found that we can say that attitudes explain the difference. Before proceeding, I must say that we are working also on several objections or problems with the bombs to banners thesis. And one counter-argument, perhaps, is that even within armed campaigns, there is, of course, a lot of unarmed activity. The People's War Doctrine also emphasized the need to build solid support from the population through various kinds of organizational work that was not directly linked to the armed struggle. So the armed struggle as such was only a part of it. But the difference between People's War and unarmed campaigns is that in People's War, the assumption is that power grows out of the barrel of a gun. And all the organizational work is meant to back up the armed struggle, which will lead to a military political victory in the end. And it will move through stages. You start with a guerrilla campaign, then you establish liberated territories, you have sanctuaries, you establish regiment-size units, and then higher units, and you move into more conventional warfare. You surround the cities, and you win finally power. That's in a way the Maoist doctrine. In an unarmed campaign, you you show the determination of and the anger of the population, and you use sophisticated means to demonstrate or occupy houses. You have hunger strikes, you have a whole repertoire of unarmed or non-violent tactics that you can use to impress the media and impress the government. And if there then is factional divisions in the government, you can play upon that, and there can be a sudden change. Very different tactics, and they have been mixed. We can also see that in the unarmed campaigns, there is actually quite a lot of violence. So we cannot say that it's non-violent. There was much violence also from the side of the demonstrators in Beijing 1989 and in Yangon 1988 against, for instance, agents of the security police who were sometimes killed in brutal ways by demonstrators. And we've also seen in the yellow shirt and red shirt campaigns in Bangkok that there has been military organization, military style provision, logistical arrangements, and also you had the black shirts, and you had quite a lot of weapons behind also the demonstrations last year that provoked the coup in May. So there is a mix, but still there is this essential difference between the two tactics. I also mentioned already that although there have been few agreements, peace agreements in the region, there have been two important ones, the Aceh one and the Cambodian one. And I would particularly emphasize the role of the Cambodian agreement in 1991, which is not so often mentioned as a successful peace agreement because it did not end the conflict in Cambodia. The Khmer Rouge went back to fighting afterwards, but I would say that that was probably a fortunate effect of the agreement as well, that the Khmer Rouge would be marginalized and could be decimated and destroyed as a political force because of the particularly nasty character of that movement. So the outcome of the 1991 agreement was actually that the whole of Indochina has disappeared from our statistics of armed conflict. It's not ideal countries, but there has also been substantial economic growth and more prosperity in both Laos, Cambodia, and in Vietnam in that period. So I would want to resurrect the Cambodian agreement in 1991. Now, I've actually been thinking about a project where one could try to explain why the agreement between France and Vietnam in 1946 failed. The 1954 Geneva Agreement on Indochina failed. The 1962 Geneva Agreement on Laos failed. The 1973 agreement between the United States and Vietnam failed. And then, finally, the 1991 agreement was something that we must call a success. To compare those agreements. So it's not so that armed conflicts in the region have never ended in agreements. It has in Indochina and it has in Indonesia. And the Aceh agreement in Indonesia was not just important for Aceh itself. It was important also in the context of all of Indonesia, since it also led actually to other, at the same time at least, other conflicts in Indonesia that could have escalated also died down and gave way to a more peaceful Indonesia. But then, of course, a counter-argument to the thesis is also that there are some armed conflicts that have continued. And those are the armed conflicts in Myanmar and in Mindanao. Much of the thesis will depend a little also on what now happens in Myanmar. If the apparent democratization of Myanmar leads to peace, the negotiations that we have just now seen, a new round for a national ceasefire, if they succeed, if you can have relatively peaceful elections next year, it would much strengthen the thesis of the East Asian peace. If it goes wrong in Myanmar, it would weaken it. And the same thing with the peace agreement for Mindanao. If it works and you see a reduction in armed conflict, in a way the thesis is strengthened, and Thailand will be even more of an exceptional case. Because Thailand is exceptional also because during the Cold War, when there was so much armed conflict in the rest of the area, there was relatively little armed conflict in Thailand. Thailand was a part of the international struggle, sending troops and providing bases and so on. But the communist insurgency in Thailand was relatively short, from the 1970s to 1980. And the number of people killed in the communist insurgency is estimated to have been lower than the number of people killed since 2004 here in South Thailand. So Thailand managed to navigate through the area of endemic war in the region without having much war. But then when the rest of the region became more peaceful, Thailand started to have more conflict. So here it's not just a question of continuing, it's a question of starting things. Yes, I forgot the last point here, which is also important. I said how we distinguish between categories of armed conflict, and one category is territorial, internal armed conflict over territory, a secession or liberation conflict. Another is the conflict over government. And we see very clearly from our statistics that the change from bombs to banners has mainly taken place when it comes to conflicts over government. The old-style communist insurgency that aimed to topple the government and make a revolution, establish a new kind of regime, has more or less disappeared. You have some of that still with the communists in the Philippines, but the communist conflict is less intense than the territorial conflicts of the Moro. When it comes to territorial conflicts, there has not been such a dramatic change from armed conflict to unarmed campaigns. You have seen examples of it. I think Timor-Leste can be seen as an example where you started with an armed struggle, but the armed struggle was defeated. Then unarmed means of struggle took over. You got the Dili massacre in 1991, which was in a way repression of an unarmed campaign. And this paved the way for the successful secession of Timor-Leste in the end, which was more due to unarmed means than to the armed struggle. But this tendency to change for territorial conflicts is lesser than for conflicts over government. So that may partially explain perhaps why things have gone the way they have gone in South Thailand. This is a graph showing the number of people killed in armed conflict in Southeast Asia. And you can see here how Indochina disappears out of it. Vietnam is already out of it when it starts. Cambodia disappears through the 1990s when the Khmer Rouge are finally defeated. And you get a bout of violence in Indonesia after the end of Suharto, and it lasts until 2005. When you had the Aceh Agreement. I think it's interesting also for us researchers that many researchers who were specialists on Indonesia followed the increasing violence after the end of Suharto regime and started a lot of research projects on a conflict in Indonesia. So after the violence had ended in Indonesia, a lot of books and articles came out in the next years about the endemic violence in Indonesia and explaining the violence. But then also that stream of books has ended because of the violence has ended, only with a delay. But I have not seen books and articles trying really to explain why Indonesia became more peaceful. Other researchers who deal with democratization or devolution of power are active in explaining things that have happened in Indonesia. But in a way, the whole, for instance, crisis group that used to have such an attention to Indonesia has, because it deals with conflict, of course, it's perhaps natural, but the attention to peace is often so much less than the attention to conflict. So people tend to think that there is more conflict than there actually is. Then you have the Philippines, which continues, although on a somewhat lower level than before. And you have Thailand, of course, coming up. So this is the picture, and the figures are, historically speaking, very low. Here are our our figures for 2012 and 2013 for the ongoing armed conflicts in East Asia. You see, we got a little conflict also in Sabah last year, which is probably not going to continue. And we have a number of armed conflicts in Myanmar that could end if you have a successful national ceasefire, perhaps optimistically. And then you have the Philippines and Thailand. And the numbers that we used in Uppsala are somewhat different from those used by a Deep South Watch. So now to my questions, where I cannot give answers, I just have interrogation marks. I'm asking you to help me. Does it have to do with the character of the Thai state? That it's so centralized that it does not allow local autonomy of the kind that you have, for instance, seen established in Indonesia, and that you also have in a federal state like Malaysia? Is that the main reason why the conflict has got the character it's got here in South Thailand? It's been impossible in a way to fight for your local demands with other means than arms. Is it because of the military influence in Thailand that it has never been under civilian control? Is it because of the polarized politics that developed between the Reds and the Yellows, between Thaksin and the network monarchy? Or is there something special about the South? This is just a comparison between the Deep South Watch and our PRIO figures for the conflict in the South, but I think I will skip it because I see that the time is now short. So my big question is, why did the insurgents here, probably in the late 1990s or perhaps earlier, decide on the kind of campaign that we have seen, with killing of teachers, assassinations, killing of many Malay Muslims who are seen as collaborators, almost daily bombings, and no clear declared leadership. A campaign that in many ways resembles the early phase of a guerrilla strategy, a people's war strategy, but continues to stay in that phase because it cannot come to the next, because it's impossible to establish the liberated zone or to get real sanctuaries in a neighboring country. Why is it that that tactic was chosen in spite of the fact that it's very unlikely to succeed? Is it because they have an illusion that it could bring a military victory? Is it because they speculate that the Thai state will fall apart, or that there will be some kind of conflict between Malaysia and Thailand in the future? Is it a hope that there could be a huge international outcry and then an international intervention? Probably not, because then one would launch attacks in Bangkok or against the tourist sites rather than concentrating just here. Is it because they don't see any alternative? So it's not really strategic at all? Or is it perhaps conservative? That the whole thing is about defending one's own way of life against intrusion by the Thai state. So the aim is not to succeed, except just to remain ourselves, so that you won't disturb us. Or is it someone calculating that the use of arms for a long time will prepare the terrain for a more softer approach from the government, so you can have negotiations? Perhaps the aims, we can understand a little bit more of the aims by looking at the demands that were made last year in connection with the dialogue that we saw in the opening sequence here. The worrisome demand here is the demand that the BRN shall be recognized as a representative of the Malay Muslims. From a civil society perspective, it's worrisome if one organization should be seen as the representative of all and be considered as such by the Thai state. But apart from that demand of recognition, of representativity, the rest of it actually resembles the demands that civil society could put up. Because there was in 2012 also a launch of a civil society initiative here, I remember, from Hat Yai, with 5 demands also that actually in some points resemble the demands from the BRN last year. But the difference is, of course, that the civil society demands includes a number of movements and organizations across the ethnic divide and that do not negotiate on the basis of an armed struggle. If there should be new negotiations, I think these are the main conditions for success. And I think you can easily see that under the present political conditions in Thailand, it's very unlikely that any of this will occur. So therefore, the most likely scenario now is a continuation of the armed struggle approximately on the same level as it has been, with no real end in sight. Quite depressive. These are the 5 aims that were declared in 2012 for civil society. But I'm trying to end my talk here with a kind of declaration in support of the project that Norbert Ropers and Sri Sompop Jitpiromsri have been working on, together with civil society organizations in this region, that the only solution I can see is some kind of conflict transformation, where a combination of negotiations and the opening up of legal politics with local elections, representations, more local autonomy, and not the least civil society initiatives and non-violent forms of struggle. Could you not do a local workshop on how one carries out a non-violent struggle? There are so many techniques and means one could use, and wouldn't it not be possible in Thailand, even now when it's under military rule, to carry out non-violent forms of struggle without risking, at least not risking more than one risks with the kind of armed struggle that is ongoing? That is my final question. Thank you.